I now invite your careful attention as we ask Brother Dave to address us on the subject, Science has not buried God.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good afternoon everyone. It's nice to see you all here and for those online as well. This talk was initially intended for an audience that might have been questioning whether or not there was a God, and looking at you this afternoon I can pretty much safely say that I think all of us in this room here have answered that question fairly satisfactorily for ourselves. But I hope that by listening to this talk this afternoon we might be able to help the conversations we have with people that might be struggling with that question and trying to work out whether or not there is a God. And with the reading we had, those two verses, it's fair to say that the world we live in has made huge strides in scientific achievements and progress. And there may be some who feel that a belief in God is rather backwards or even perhaps foolish. But I hope from listening to this talk this afternoon we'll see that in comparison to God's wisdom, even though the scientific achievements humans have made, as amazing and as advanced as they are nothing in comparison to the wisdom of God, and that science, when you look at it fully, actually supports a belief in God. So let's try and put some of these things in perspective. If the accumulation of scientific knowledge shows that God is dead and buried, to use a term, then we, the human race, and all life on this planet are nothing more than specks of dust in a universe so vast our minds cannot fully fathom. But the alternative, if science suggests that there might be a God, then I think you would agree that we have a responsibility to diligently investigate what he claims to be his word. And we've read a small portion of that just now, and I hope by the end of this talk you'll be able to encourage people to really look at the word of God and see it for what it is. And we hope that far from burying God, science will show that it strengthens a position that there is a God, and science points to his very existence. Some of you may have come across this book. It is where the subject of tonight's talk has come from, and it was put initially as a question: has science buried God? And it was written by a mathematician who is a professor at Oxford called John Lennox. And it's an extremely valuable book, and I thoroughly recommend reading it. And a lot of what we'll be saying comes from this book. And of course, there are those who believe that science has buried God and has shown that he does not exist. This is Peter Atkins. So he's another professor, I think, who was also at Oxford University. And he is one of the so-called new atheists, and they're famous for their strong views on there not being a God. And he certainly believes that science has buried God. He says science and religion cannot be reconciled, and humanity should begin to appreciate the power of its child and to beat off all attempts at compromise. Religion has failed, and its failures should stand exposed. Science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence through the identification of the minimal, the supreme delight of the intellect, should be acknowledged king. So, is he right? Do we think science is really the supreme delight of the intellect? Can science answer all our questions about the universe? Here is another scientist, Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. He's a professor of evolutionary biology at Oxford, and he says this: "It is fashionable to wax apocalyptic about the threat to humanity posed by the AIDS virus, mad cow disease, and many others, but I think that a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion." So he thinks religion, belief in God, is the same as a disease, something he wishes was eradicated. Here is a man passionate about abolishing all forms of religion. He believes it is his duty to eradicate it. And of course, these are very extreme views on one end of a spectrum. But it is these extreme views which unfortunately receive the most public attention and media coverage. And as John Lennox points out in his book, the fact that there are scientists who appear to be at war with God is not the same thing as science itself being at war with God. And this is a key point that I would like us to remember. Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. Some statements that scientists make might very well be statements of science, but it does not always follow that statements of scientists are always scientific. Do not be deceived by the prestige that any scientist holds. Some of their statements are not statements of science, they are statements of personal belief. We should not take what they say as authoritative science simply because they are famous scientists. But because they are famous scientists and they say that science shows there is no God, then unfortunately many people take that to mean that science itself says there is no God. And that is not the case. If it was, then you could argue that if there were scientists who said that science shows there is a God, then that would equally mean that science itself showed there is a God. And there are plenty of scientists that do believe in God. This is John Horton. He was professor in atmospheric physics at the University of Oxford, and he was the former chief executive at the Met Office. He said, "Our science is God's science. He holds the responsibility for the whole scientific story. The remarkable order, consistency, reliability, and fascinating complexity found in the scientific description of the universe are reflections of order, consistency, reliability, and complexity of God's activity." This is Sir Gillian Prance, prominent British botanist and ecologist, and he published extensively on taxonomy, and he was also the former director of Kew Gardens. And he says, "For many years I have believed that God is the great designer behind all nature. All my studies in science since then have confirmed my faith." And he says this, "I regard the Bible as my principal source of authority." So these are just as eminent scientists as the ones we saw that did not believe in God. So should we take what they say as science as well? And I would say no. They are too just professing personal beliefs. Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. But this does show that not all scientists are atheists, and not all theists, or those who believe in God, are clueless when it comes to science. And the question that we are presented with is then, which worldview does science actually lend more support to? Does science back up atheism, the belief that there is no God, or does it back up theism, the belief that there is a God? Which worldview does science lead to? Does it bury theism and strengthen atheism, or does it bury atheism and strengthen theism? And to answer these questions, we have to ask what science is in the first place. And contrary to popular belief, there is no actual agreed definition of what science is. And many have put forward their suggestions. One definition puts it as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And to cut a long story short, there are basically two schools of thought. One school says that science deals only with the natural, and the other says science doesn't only deal with the natural, it can deal with anything that it discovers. This is Christian de Duve. I apologise if I'm mispronouncing his name. He won the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 1974 for discovering certain features of the human cell, animal cell. He would suggest that science deals only with the natural world. Scientific inquiry rests on the notion that all manifestations in the universe are explainable in natural terms without supernatural intervention, i.e., without God intervening. He is saying that science works on the principle that only things found within the universe can explain what we see in the universe. That science works on the principle that nothing existing beyond the natural world can be used to explain what we see in the natural world. Everything manifested in the universe can be explained in natural, or in other words, not supernatural terms, i.e., God cannot be used to explain the existence of anything. But he is honest because he goes on to say this: Strictly speaking, this is a postulate, a working hypothesis. He admits that science assumes this principle. He acknowledges that if this is what science is, then it has not actually proven that there is nothing beyond the natural world. It has only assumed it as a preconceived concept. He adds that we should be prepared, however, to abandon this principle if faced with facts that defy every attempt at rational explanation. Many scientists, however, do not bother to make this distinction, tacitly extrapolating from hypothesis to affirmation. So although this scientist admits it is an assumption, he acknowledges that many scientists do not and treat it as fact. Most scientists start with assuming that there is nothing beyond the natural world, and then they do their science, which is basically applied naturalism. So what is naturalism? And that is the idea or belief that only laws of nature, as opposed to supernatural or spiritual laws, operate in the world. The idea or belief that nothing exists beyond the natural world. It is not their science which leads them to believe in naturalism. They begin with that belief before they see what evidence actually shows. And let's use an analogy to see why this approach is flawed. Imagine we had to investigate a small area of land with a metal detector. Would we be right to say that there was no plastic under the soil just because the metal detector couldn't find any? If we designed an instrument to detect only one type of material, we shouldn't be surprised when that's all it picks up. Likewise, if we set up science to only talk about the natural world, then we should not be surprised when it only comments on natural things. But there is hope. There is another school of thought held by a small number of scientists. And one of them just so happens to be the author of the book that I mentioned, John Lennox. And he sums up the other school of thought very well in his book. He says, instead of defining science as essentially applied naturalism, suppose we understand it to be investigation of and theorizing about the natural order so that we might give weight to what is surely the essence of true science. That is, a willingness to follow empirical evidence wherever it leads. So this time, if we had a small area of land, rather than using a metal detector, we should use an instrument that allowed us to investigate the presence of any materials, whether they were metal, plastic, wooden, ceramic, or any material. Scientists should not let preconceived ideas limit their appreciation for the evidence of the existence of God. And this leads us to our next question. Even if we did follow empirical evidence wherever it leads, would there be a limit to how much science would be able to explain? In other words, does science have any limits? So let's have another look then at what some scientists think. So here is Peter Atkins once again. What does he have to say on this subject? Well, he says, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. So it's fair to assume that he does not think science has any limits. And this is a view that is called scientism. It claims that science is the only route to obtaining any truth. That science can account for everything and everything. And this is the famous British philosopher Bertrand Russell, and he would seem to sympathise with this viewpoint, saying, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Well, do we believe that what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know? Well, John Lennox does a marvellous job of pointing out how this is clearly a self-refuting statement, and one which completely collapses on itself once you ask one simple question. How did Bertrand Russell know what he said? His statement is not of itself a scientific statement. So if it is true, then according to the statement itself, it is unknowable, and yet Bertrand Russell believes it to be true. If we don't yet see the absurdity of scientism, then perhaps watching a clip from a discussion between Peter Atkins and an American philosopher called William Lane Craig will help us. So at this point, I hope that this works. We'll see.
Taken together with a reason why people believe, desperate to believe, together with the fact that you don't need actually a God, in a sense amounts to an argument against the existence of God.
Well, I guess I don't see that. I mean, why doesn't that commit the genetic fallacy of trying to say that by explaining how a belief originates, you thereby show the belief to be false? Even if it were true that belief in the existence of God were the product of fear and anxiety and so forth, which I don't for a minute admit, but even if it were, that's simply a genetic fallacy to say that because that's the way the belief originates, that therefore the belief is false.
But that's only one half of the argument. I'm not saying that that alone is adequate, and I'm not saying that the fact that science can account for everything alone is also adequate. But taken together, the fact that science is omnipotent, and the fact that I can understand why people like you desperately want to believe in God, that is an argument against the existence of God.
Two fallacious arguments put together don't make a sound argument, right?
But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science...
So what can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list five. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory. So none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us. And
So there we go. He lists 5 things which science cannot prove, but which are rational to accept. Logical and mathematical truths, metaphysical truths, ethical beliefs, aesthetic judgments, and science itself. So the answer to our question, does science have limits? I think we'd agree with William Lane Craig there that it does have limits. And we need to take this point in. Science does have limits. There are questions science cannot answer. This is Francis Collins, who was director of the Human Genome Project, and he's a very qualified scientist, and he said, science is powerless to answer questions such as, why did the universe come into being? What is the meaning of human existence? What happens to us after we die? So not all scientists think science can answer everything. And Bertrand Russell, although he wrote statements that sounded as if he believed in scientism or that science had no limits, he did not actually subscribe to the full-blown view that Peter Atkins does. Bertrand Russell believed that all definite knowledge belonged to science and that knowledge gained from other sources was just less definite. And he admitted, however, all the interesting questions reside outside the scope of science. Is the world divided into mind and matter? And if so, what is mind and what is matter? Has the universe any unity or purpose? Is it evolving towards some goal? Are there really laws of nature, or do we believe in them only because of our innate love of order? Is man what he seems to the astronomer, a tiny lump of impure carbon and water impotently crawling on a small and unimportant planet? Or is he what he appears to Hamlet? Is there a way of living that is noble and another that is base? Or are there all ways of living merely futile? To such questions no answers can be found in the laboratory. Interesting questions, to say the least. And maybe Russell is right and we cannot answer these questions with certainty. But what is clear is that neither can science. What Peter Atkins says, therefore, that there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence and there is nothing that cannot be understood, is a statement that has lots of problems. To make our point really clear, we're going to use two analogies which John Lennox also uses in his book. Now, some of us might recognise this cake. So, John very kindly allowed me to use this delicious cake in the talk this afternoon. And we're going to pretend that we don't know why this cake was made, but of course we all do, and we've enjoyed some this afternoon. But if we didn't know why it was made, and we tried to find out, we took it to some scientists, and we took it to lots of different scientists, we took it to some nutritionists, and we asked them, is this caramac or is this caramel, or what ingredients is in the cake, how did it, how many calories are in it, and we took it to some biochemists, and we asked them to, they could draw detailed representations of the structure of the carbohydrates and all the fats the cake's made of. We took it to some chemists and they could provide us with a comprehensive list of all the chemical elements contained in those carbohydrates and fats and how they all bonded together. And we could take it to some physicists and they could submit an analysis of all the fundamental particles that constitute the making of those chemicals. And we could take it to some mathematicians and they could show us all these equations for how all of these particles behave in their resting conditions. They all give excellent answers for what the cake is made of and how it's stayed together, but none of them can give you an answer for why that cake was made. We could only get that from John. We'll only ever know why the cake was made if the reason is revealed to us from its maker. So now for the second analogy. Imagine a car. Can anybody tell me what this car is? Aston Martin. Okay, I got that right. Last time I got it wrong, so I wanted to make sure it was right this time. Imagine someone, let's say from a very remote part of the world, who's never seen a moving vehicle before, let alone this car, an Aston Martin. That person might imagine that there is a God inside the bonnet of the car. Let's say he calls this God Mr. Martin. He might even imagine that when the car runs smoothly, it's because the God, or Mr. Martin inside the car, is happy with him. When the car won't start and it's rattling loudly and makes strange noises, our friend might believe that Mr. Martin is angry with him. And one day our friend happens to enroll on a mechanical engineering course and he learns all about the workings of the combustion engine. And I think this is the engine from an Aston Martin, but I might be wrong. And one day he happens to find out all about spark plugs and cylinders and gears, and then he realises, the penny drops. He rushes to his garage, he opens the bonnet, and expecting to see Mr. Martin, he sees the engine of the Aston Martin lying there. What he decides next is crucial. Does he say, at last, I know how the car really works. There's an engine inside, turning petrol energy into movement. I don't need to use Mr. Martin anymore to understand how this car works. My new understanding of how the engine works now makes it pointless for me to believe in the existence of Mr. Martin. Or does he say this? At last, I know how the car really works. There's an engine inside turning petrol energy into movement. I don't need to use Mr. Martin anymore to understand how this car works. But my new understanding of how the engine works still leaves me with having to explain where the engine came from. Maybe there is a Mr. Martin or a God who made the engine in the first place. And this highlights the difference between mechanism and agency. Mechanism relates to the how of why the engine works. agency relates to Mr. Martin, who designed the engine. And we have to keep this in mind when it comes to science and what science has discovered. Science can show us the mechanism in nature, but does finding mechanisms mean there is no agent? Does knowing how the engine works means no one designed it? I don't think so. Mechanisms point to agents or agencies. So summing up so far, firstly, we should follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it suggests something might have a supernatural cause. Secondly, we believe that science does suggest there is a designer behind this world. And thirdly, science has limits to what it can tell us. It can say how, but it cannot say why. And we need revelation to know purpose. So John Lennox says in his book, when Sir Isaac Newton discovered the universal law of gravitation, he did not say, I have discovered a mechanism which accounts for planetary motion, therefore there is no agent, God, who designed it. Quite the opposite. He said, precisely because he understood how it worked, he was moved to increase admiration for the God who had designed it that way. The universal law of gravitation, which helps explain how the planets orbit around the sun, is just one discovery science has made, which has led at least one scientist to believe that there is a designer behind this universe. Now let's see if there is anything else which might suggest there is an intelligent designer or creator. Does science show evidence of design? Well, we suggest there is ample evidence from science to suggest there is a designer. The rational intelligibility of the universe, the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the complexity of living organisms. We shall look at the last one, the complexity of biological life, in the greatest detail. Let's just begin by looking at what is called the rational intelligibility of the universe. Albert Einstein famously said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. In order for us to embark on any study, scientific or otherwise, we have to first assume that we have minds capable of reasoning and reliably interpreting the information we receive. As John Lennox says, we cannot even question the validity of this principle without assuming it in the first place. We apply our minds to studying the universe and we discover, as Newton did, that it has an amazing order, structure and mathematical laws governing its existence that we can understand. Our minds are capable of understanding and recognizing this order. And does this not point to an intelligence that is the agent behind it all? Or did this order simply arise by chance out of chaos? Now let's think about the beginning of the universe. Did the universe have a beginning? Scientists up until recently agreed that the universe did have a beginning, and it's been a bit more of a question recently, but it's still, by and large, what many scientists say, that the universe had a beginning. And why? Well, because there's evidence from something called the redshift in light from distant galaxies, there's something called the cosmic microwave background, and laws of thermodynamics that still suggest that the universe had a fixed beginning. We don't have time to go into each of these now, but suffice it to say there is good evidence that science shows the universe had a beginning. And why is this important? It's important because it forms something called the Kalan cosmological argument, and it says that all things which have a beginning have a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And of course we then want to ask, well, what was the cause of the universe? Eventually, you have to have something without a beginning. If it doesn't have a beginning, then it doesn't need a cause. Otherwise, you end up with infinite regressions of causes. Ultimately, we need a cause without a beginning. Something that is eternal. And we suggest that something is God. So let's now look at the fine-tuning of the universe. Physicists have shown the universe to be fine-tuned to a degree that is so eye-wateringly precise, it leaves the mind boggling. They have discovered a group of forces in nature that were they to differ by the smallest fraction, it would render all life completely dead. And let's look at a few examples of these. There are two forces in physics called the nuclear strong force and the electromagnetic force. We don't need to go into what they are, we just want to appreciate that these two forces each have a certain precise value and that there is a ratio between their values. This is theoretical physicist Paul Davies, and he says if the ratio of the nuclear strong force to the electromagnetic force had been different by 1 part in 10 to the 16, then no stars could have formed. That means no sun. That means no us. And he continues, again, the ratio of the electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant must be equally delicately balanced. Increase it by only 1 part in 10 to the 40, then the universe would only contain small stars. Decrease it by the same amount, and the universe would only contain large stars. In order for life, you must have both small and large stars. And that number is 1 in 10 to the 40. So if it were to change by a value of more than 1 in 10 to the power of 40, it would destroy all life. And that number is basically 1 in 10 with 40 zeros after it. That is a ridiculously small chance of it occurring by itself. And an illustration might help us understand just how small 1 in 10 to the 40 is. So if you were to cover every square inch of the United States in coins, and you raise it up in a column, reaching to the moon, that is a distance of 380,000 kilometres, or 236,000 miles. And you imagine that column of coins that are covering the United States all the way up to the moon. You paint one of those coins red and place it in one of the piles of coins, and you ask a friend to pick out the painted coin. The chance that they would pick out that coin is 1 in 10 to the power of 40. That is the same probability that this universe is finely tuned to. And there are many other parameters. We don't have time to look at them all this evening, but they include the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force to gravitational force, the rate of entropy, distance from the Earth to the Sun, the speed of Earth's orbit, and many, many more. If the Earth was only 2% closer to the Sun, all water would evaporate. If it was 2% further away, we would all freeze to death. If the world rotated too slowly, then the differences between day and night temperatures would be too extreme. If we rotated too quickly, then the wind speeds would be lethal. So this is just evidence showing how finely tuned the universe is. And finally, we're going to look at the complexity of biological life. And we really need to appreciate the true complexity of biological life. If we think that the fine-tuning in physics was something special, then we haven't seen anything yet. This is Michael Denton. He's a geneticist, and he says the break between living and the non-living world represents the most dramatic and fundamental of all the discontinuities of nature. Between a living cell and the most highly ordered non-biological systems, such as crystal or a snowflake, there is a chasm so vast and absolute it is possible to conceive. So he's saying that we think these are incredibly complex, while actually the gap between these structures and biological structures is huge. And the best place to begin is to think about proteins. Proteins are things found in living organisms, and they're essential for life. And some proteins that we may well know include things like hemoglobin, found in our blood, or antibodies, which make up part of our immune system, or fibrin, which is found in our blood vessels when they're damaged, and it helps to form clots. All proteins are made from things called amino acids, and each amino acid has the same basic chemical structure, and they're made up of the same fundamental chemical elements: nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then they have slight variations represented by that R. But there are only 20 amino acids which occur in living organisms. They all have the same nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen and oxygen unit, but they have this different side chain represented here by the letter R. So they all have the same basic structure, and then the 20 different ones have slightly different R's. And here's a list of the 20 amino acids which all help make up proteins. And to make a protein, you have to have a number of amino acids joined up in a row, which then bend together to form a 3D shape. So here we have like a representation of a protein, and each one of these circles is an amino acid. In order for a protein to work, it has to bend into the right shape. So if fibrin was the wrong shape, then your blood wouldn't be able to form a scab and you might bleed to death. If antibodies weren't the right shape, you wouldn't be able to fight off infections and you would die from the common cold. If hemoglobin was the wrong shape, then you wouldn't be able to carry oxygen around your body very well. And there is a representation of hemoglobin. And as you can see, it consists of 4 coils. 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are all made up of amino acids that have joined together and have bent into precise shape. And if it was different, it wouldn't work the same way. In order to have proteins to be the right shape, you have to have the right number of amino acids, and they all have to be in the right order. So getting a protein right depends on there being the right number of amino acids, and those amino acids being in the right order. If one amino acid is out of place, it could mean the entire protein molecule fails to bend into the right shape, and then it becomes broken. It might not work. Most proteins consist of at least 300 amino acids. So there's an example, but most proteins consist of 300 of these little circles. Now let's imagine we want to make a protein which only has 100 amino acids, or 100 of these little circles. We won't go into all the calculations, but it would be, the chance of getting it right would be the same as 1 in 10 to the 125. So this would be, if we had longer, we'd go through the calculation. But it comes out, the chance of getting it right, to make a protein with 100 amino acids in it, the chances of that just happening by chance would be 1 in 10 to the 125. So that's 1 in 10 with 125 zeros after it. And this is for only one protein, and one protein with only 100 amino acids. Most proteins have 300 amino acids in them. So life as we know it requires not one, but hundreds of thousands of proteins to work. And it has been calculated that the odds of producing these by chance are in the realms of 1 in 10 to the 40,000. And if we think about that analogy of those coins going up to the moon, the chance of that happening are absolutely infinitesimal. This is Fred Hoyle. He was an accomplished astronomer, and although he was an atheist, he famously compared the odds of protein just coming about by chance in this way to like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and forming a fully functioning Boeing 74 jet aircraft. So how do our bodies ensure that the right amino acids join together in the right sequence? How does it happen? Well, it has machinery and software so complex and sophisticated that humans can only dream of inventing. And I'm sure we've all heard of DNA. And as we said at the beginning, it's evident that humans have made remarkable scientific discoveries. But to this day, they do not know where DNA originated and how it came to exist. They have their theories, but it remains ultimately a mystery. And we would suggest that this remarkable creation was created by God. It is the ultimate pinnacle of design. And perhaps if we watch another short clip, that will help us put it into perspective. In order to do that, I'm going to have to open it from here and show you this clip, which will hopefully show you the level of detail and incredible complexity of DNA, and hopefully show you that this surely did not come about by chance. So this is a scientist that has done a lot of work in DNA and has made computer models to show how it works in all of our living cells.
Inspired by this image many years ago, and I wondered whether we could use computer graphics to represent the molecular world. What would it look like? And that's how I really began. So let's begin. This is DNA in its classic double helix form, and it's from X-ray crystallography, so it's an accurate model of DNA. If we unwind the double helix and unzip the two strands, you see these things that look like teeth. Those are the letters of genetic code, the 25,000 genes you've got written in your DNA. This is what they typically talk about, the genetic code. This is what they're talking about. But I want to talk about a different aspect of DNA science, and that is the physical nature of DNA. And it's these two strands that run in opposite directions for reasons I can't go into right now, but they physically run in opposite directions, which creates a number of complications for your living cells, as you're about to see, most particularly when DNA is being copied. And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in, it hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and you can see these things spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating two new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring the right way inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation, and it's pretty much at the correct speed for what's occurring inside you, but I've left out error correction and a bunch of other things. This was work from a number of years ago. Thank you. This is work from a number of years ago, but what I want to show you next is updated science. It's updated technology. So again, we begin with DNA, and it's jiggling and wiggling there because of the surrounding supermolecules, which are stripped away so you can see something. DNA is about 2 nanometers across, which is really quite tiny. But in each one of your cells, each strand of DNA is about 30 to 40 million nanometers long. So to keep the DNA organized, to regulate access to the genetic code, it's wrapped around these purple proteins, I've labeled them purple here. It's packaged up and bundled up. All of its field of view is a single strand of DNA. This huge package of DNA is called a chromosome, and we'll come back to chromosomes in a minute. We're pulling out, we're zooming out through a nuclear pore, which is sort of the gateway to this compartment that holds all the DNA called the nucleus. All of this field of view is about a semester's worth of biology, and I've got 7 minutes, so we're not going to be able to do that today. No, I'm being told no. This is the way a living cell looks down a light microscope, and it's been filmed.
I'll just stop it there, and if we had time we could watch the whole thing, but it's just incredible how DNA works, and it's through this DNA that we have the code for the proteins that we have in our bodies, and it is a language that is written, and I would suggest God has written and created, that allows us to live, and it's mind-blowing. And although science has shown that it has made incredible achievements, I think that if we realise that this points towards a creator, we have to accept that whoever created this is vastly more intelligent and wise than we are. And if this is not evidence for a creator, then I don't know what is. So I hope that this afternoon we've been able to see that science has not buried God. Far from it. It has shown that indeed science strengthens the support for God. And if it suggests that there is a God, then the next question is, what is our response? We've seen that DNA is a code, it's a written language. Well, God has written another book, the Bible. Do we just simply carry on living our lives, or do we wake up and listen to what the designer has to say to us? He has written a book which is open to us all to read. And do we read it with the same awe and amazement that we do to the natural world when we see its amazing discoveries? And he says in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. He says, remember the former things of old, For I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from the ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. And in Isaiah 46, he says, he has also said that he has appointed... Sorry, I haven't got that. But he has said that he has also appointed a day in which he's going to send his Son back to the earth to set up an everlasting kingdom. And if we want to be part of that kingdom, then we have to believe in him. We have to be baptized. We have to try and follow the example of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ.